Welcome to the Equity Conscious Leader, a new generation equity podcast and YouTube channel where we chat with leaders about tangible system change and strategies to advance and sustain equity work in their organizations. Our conversations dive deep into the 6 dimensions of equity conscious leadership. So how do you lead with transformational system change for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? Let's find out on this episode of the Equity Conscious Leader with your host and educational equity leader, Dr. Jag Lathan.
Again, going back to cultural humility, for me, I ask questions. That is part of my process, right, of trying to listen. But oftentimes we listen to respond, and that's the problem when it comes to, most relationships. Folks are listening to respond and not really listening to understand and to empathize and to truly work on making change. Mm-hmm. So the example that I think of is when you have a child that doesn't look like you and they're sitting in the room, one, there is a power differential that happens, right? And so that engagement is going to be so important to create change in that relationship. That also reflects in organizations. When you have, oftentimes we're not, as people, Black people, brown people, sometimes we're the only one in the room. And so how do you create space for them to speak up around the things that may make true change?
And so tell us, what do you think in terms of just that, what you just said, because I have been in spaces where I'm the only Black person, or the only woman, and or the only educator, which is so interesting when you have people who are not educators creating policy for educators, right? Mm-hmm. And so then what is your idea or your experience around, so then how do you create these conditions for deep listening?
Yeah, so I think we have to acknowledge that there are some differences that are happening, right? Because if we don't name it, then how can we change it or embrace it or to do anything with it? So, oftentimes, people aren't going to be in a meeting, a conference, and want to name that, hey, there's only 2, people of color in this training. But the training itself should have a cultural component to it, right? So in meetings, when we talk about ground rules, we have to talk about acknowledging that the space needs to feel safe for everyone. And there are going to be differences, cultural differences that make a difference and how someone speaks up. And that we don't want to create an environment where that person doesn't feel safe speaking up. So, for me as a trainer, when I'm in the room, I do that, right? Those initial rules have to be, or ground rules or safe space rules, acknowledging. And in the introduction, I may ask them to acknowledge something that they bring to the room that feels uncomfortable for them, right? So that we can start off on a kind of as equal of, footing as we can, mm-hmm. right? And acknowledge that the space doesn't feel safe right now. And then it's up to the person who's facilitating that space to then observe the room and continue to make it safe, a safe place for people to speak up.
Okay. Thank you. Any other thoughts you have around listening, deep listening, and transformational change and the connection there?
I think if we remember that this is an internal and external process, that we are not only paying attention to ourselves and what we bring to the room, but also recognize that there is an internal process that's happening within the person that we're engaging with. Right? We are all human beings, and we have to remember that we have these experiences that will color the way we see things, the way that we speak, the way that we want to make systemic change. And so that engagement has to be on that human level, right? That cultural understanding, that cultural humility, right? And being able to name what's happening, right? How are we ever going to get to a place of change if we don't talk about the feelings that we're having, if we don't talk about the impact that it's had on us? And that's what a true survey is, right? When you are surveying the people who are making or have the ability or who are affected, you are trying to find out what the impact is. And if you want to change outcomes, you have to do things in a way that is not just, again, that's like on the outside appearance. It is true internal work. And I think that that's what I appreciated about that series that the county brought, is that, you know, if we're not looking at ourselves and what we are doing in the room, then we're focused on what the other person is doing, then that doesn't create change. But if we're looking at what I can do differently, how I can show up differently, and how I can support the other person in being their most authentic self, then, you know, that is the start for change.
How does leadership hold space for new voices to be heard, new ideas to surface, and new leaders to emerge? So holding the space for that in terms of hearing from new voices, because that's often a challenge when new people enter organizations or a new space.
Yeah, so, you know, I think as a leader, it really does go back to observation. We aren't just about what you can do for me as a leader, but what can I do for you in order to improve our system together, right? So a true leader, in my opinion, is a person who is cultivating others behind them or around them, right? You are supporting them in their needs. And once, you know, it's that hierarchical change, right? So if we are working, one of the examples that I think of is, if I'm treating my staff poorly, how do you think they're going to treat our clients, right? So if our clients' needs are being met, and our staff feel good about the work that they're doing, right, they're going to continue to do that work.
Yeah, and most of the time people, like one piece of satisfaction that employees often have is when they feel heard and seen in their organization.
Yes. Yeah, so, you know, oftentimes we don't explain the broader picture to people. We just want them to do what we tell them to do. And you can't get true change by just saying, you're my workhorse, this is what you're going to do to make change. No, I need to understand what the change is about. Why are we doing this? And so,
and what input do I have to help support that? Because often the people who are actually doing the work have a lot of information on how things can happen differently and more effectively.
Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Akilah Vazquez, for sharing your expertise and your experience with us. Deep listening and dialogue is so very imperative and important for transformational change, and you've really highlighted those important areas for us.
Thank you for having me.